So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Brian, and I'm with Karsten Moss. He'll be helping to answer questions. You'll see there's a Q&A pod to the right there. So today we're talking about ensuring reliability of your outgoing email. So we'll start by just briefly explaining the problem, going into a little bit more explanation of it, understanding the problem, fixing the problem, and then I'll do several demonstrations. So defining the problem, email you send is unreliable. It's becoming a bit more of a problem these days with the increase of anti-spam measures and new technologies. So as an administrator, you may have run into some of these situations, end users asking, why is my email ending up in everyone's junk email folder? Why am I getting these bounce messages? What do they mean? Why are we on a blacklist? Or why is it taking so long to send mail? Maybe you get a bounce back saying that it's been delayed, and it might take up to an hour for somebody to receive a message. So these are the common types of symptoms that you might encounter, and so that's what we'll be talking about, how to address these problems. So understanding the problem. So why does this situation happen? Well, most likely it's because your IP address is not trustworthy. So that's a very important thing, is to make sure that your IP address is clean, that you're not on any blacklists, and the way to do that is conforming to standards, but then also making sure that you're doing all the things you can do to properly identify yourself, so not being too anonymous. And there's several technologies that we'll talk about here to help to properly identify yourself. So first and foremost, protecting your IP address to basically prevent being listed on a blacklist. And you see there's a large list of items here. So certainly you want to make sure you have a static IP address. If you're on a dynamic IP, almost for sure you will be on a blacklist. There's an option to hide the local IP and received headers, and I'll show that during the demo. But basically, if you're sending mail from the Kerio Connect client or any outside, maybe if you're at home but you're somewhere outside the network, you're probably going to be on a dynamic IP address, which is most likely going to be listed on a blacklist. And so when Kerio Connect is relaying that message, it will normally insert the IP address into the headers of the message, and a lot of receiving mail servers will actually parse all of the headers and may end up finding that private IP, or sorry, the dynamic IP address, and then as a result, your mail would not be accepted because that IP might be on a blacklist. Avoid sending bulk email. If you do have any kind of marketing campaigns or anything like that, it's suggested to use an outside service, like for example here at Kerio we use Marketo. There's other services, MailChimp is another popular one, but just if you can, try to use an external mailing service for sending large volumes of mail, and not using the mailing list feature in Kerio Connect for that purpose. Using mailing lists primarily just for internal communications. Avoid sharing an IP with other servers, which is kind of similar to a point later on there. But basically, if you have a web server that sends out any kind of email that maybe you don't have control over what people might be putting in a web form, and maybe the content there is not acceptable. And so therefore the IP address that they're sending from might be listed on a blacklist or flagged as spam. So basically the IP that you're using for your Kerio Connect server would be on that same spam blacklist. So if you can, try to give your Kerio Connect server a dedicated IP address so that it's not being shared with other servers that you may not have control over. So the other point I was mentioning is to lock down port 25. So if your Kerio Connect server is on a local network with other computers, I'm sure you've maybe run into the circumstance where somebody mistakenly installs some malware, virus, whatever. It starts sending a lot of outbound spam, and as a result, your IP address ends up being blacklisted. So the suggestion there is, if you have a firewall in place, which most likely you do, to make sure that outbound port 25 is restricted so that only your Kerio Connect server is able to send outbound mail on that port. Disabling spam repellent. So this is a fairly effective anti-spam feature, but it can also have an adverse effect in that when you send outbound mail, there is an anti-spam feature that some mail servers use called callback verification, where it will actually try to open a connection back to the sending server. And if you've got that spam repellent turned on, that process of that callback verification might time out, and as a result, the receiving mail server will actually refuse the incoming mail. So the suggestion there is to either disable spam repellent altogether or to reduce it to a value that's less than, say, 20 seconds, just to make sure that you don't hit any of those a timeout. There's a number of monitoring services for verifying the kind of cleanliness or the health of your IP address. The one I typically recommend is MX Toolbox. They've got a lot of nice little tools for checking the health of your MTA, and they have a free blacklist monitoring service that you can subscribe to, so I definitely recommend checking that out. And of course, they have on-demand blacklist lookup, so you can always input your IP address there to verify whether or not it's showing up on any of the common blacklists. Another option is senderbase.org. It's a similar tool. They have their own blacklist. I believe Cisco is managing them, and also GoDaddy, I think, is using their service. So there's some interesting options on there as well for seeing if there's any other IP addresses within the same subnet that might also show up on a blacklist. I have heard cases where maybe not your IP is blacklisted, but another host in your subnet is, and that might impact you. So it's good to use Senderbase to check the trustworthiness or the status of other IP addresses that are nearby to you. So if you can avoid backscatter, this is basically a result of using store and forward. So if you're in a situation where you're collecting all mail for a domain as opposed to immediately rejecting a connection if it's an unknown recipient, for example, you may end up in the circumstance where Kerio Connect is receiving all of the mail, and because the sender address is spoofed, the bounce back will actually go to an external service. So basically, as you see in the diagram here, this would be representing the spammer. They're sending a mail to the Kerio Connect. Under normal circumstances, it would be rejected as spam and just filtered right away or bounced back to the sender. But in the case of backscanner, the sender address is spoofed, and as the mail server collects the message, when it sends the bounce, it actually goes to the spoofed address and not to the actual spammer. So this is sort of the idea of how backscatter happens. It's almost like a form of open relay in that your mail server is actually relaying spam messages. So if you can avoid these situations of a store and forward for your domain, or if you are bouncing spam messages, there is an option in the spam filter that you can send a failure notification to messages that are considered as spam. So don't enable that option. So this is, again, backscatter. There's more information, as I referenced here, on Wikipedia if you want to read more about that. So definitely, if you can, conform to internet standards. It adds to your trustworthiness when you're kind of following the rules. A lot of receiving mail servers appreciate when you sort of abide by RFC standards. Obviously, spammers are nonconformists. They don't follow standards. So the more you follow the standard, the more you will appear as a legitimate, trustworthy sender. Some of the ways to conform to standards: first and foremost, you need a fully qualified internet host name, and I'll show during the demonstration where you can go to configure that. You need a postmaster alias. So this is used if there's any kind of issue on the receiving mail server's end that there is some mechanism for contacting the owner of the sender domain or of your domain, and that's typically assumed as a postmaster email address. So I'll, in the demo, show where to configure that, although most of you probably know it's under the aliases, but I'll show that nonetheless. And then also making sure that you don't reduce the delivery retry interval below 30 minutes. The RFC, I think, is one of those, it's highly recommended not to drop below 30 minutes, although it's maybe not a direct violation. But I think if you do, in other words, if you're very persistent and every, let's say, 5 minutes you're trying to resend the message to get it through, maybe you're being graylisted or something like that, the receiving mail server may not appreciate that behavior and might end up putting you on a blacklist or just straight up not refusing mail from you. So that's another tip for kind of playing by the rules. And then, of course, if you enjoy reading RFCs, 2821 is the one I'm referencing here, and you'll see from the link how to where to get more information on that RFC. So identifying yourself, and that's kind of the next few slides, is all about identifying yourself to add your trustworthiness. One of the most important things you can do is to configure a pointer record or a reverse lookup record, which is a way to allow the receiving server to identify who you are. So us as users, when we're connecting to some remote server, we connect to a domain name, which is a forward lookup, which resolves to an IP address. Servers do the opposite. They get a connection from an IP address, and they need to resolve that to a domain name. So it's a reverse type of lookup that generally servers do. And this, of course, is something that helps to make your server more trustworthy. So how does it work? The receiving server performs the reverse lookup based on your IP. This is called a PTR type of DNS lookup. One important distinction about configuring this type of DNS record is that you can't normally do it through your own DNS management tool. You actually have to go through the internet service provider to update this record because it's the maintainer of the IP address that's responsible for creating this type of DNS record. It's actually not the owner of the domain name, it's the owner of the IP address. So may or may not be easy for you to track down the responsible person to update this record. It might be a little bit difficult, but it's very important nonetheless. And as far as the value that you should be defining there, it typically should be the internet host name of your Kerio Connect server. So maybe what's on the SSL certificate, but certainly what you've defined as the internet host name parameter, which I'll show in the demo. And that name that you provide there should also resolve in a forward lookup, so they'll be sort of inverses of each other. And again, I'll show that in just a few minutes. And if you want to learn more about RDNS or reverse DNS, again, I've got the link for that from Wikipedia here. And just to show you a quick screenshot from our management setup here, this is, you can see my colleague Carson is kind of laughing because part of it's in German here. This is actually a server we have. It's a virtual server running in a Golo facility in Dusseldorf, Germany. But they have a nice control panel. Fortunately, most of it's in English, so I can make sense of it. But as you see there, this is where you would go within their interface to configure your reverse DNS settings. So you'll notice there, if I grab the pointer, this is our IP address, and I've configured the host name as our kind of fictitious domain name as bindbrewing.com. So the internet host name is mail.bindbrewing.com, which happens to also be the NX record that I've configured and is the internet host name that I've configured in Kerio Connect. So here, this is an example of where you might go to configure it, depending on your ISP, you might have to make a phone call to somebody. I know that Rackspace, if you use their virtual servers, I believe they give you some type of similar interface for managing pointer records or reverse DNS within their control panel. So DKIM, this is another very effective way to identify yourself. This is something actually we added in a recent release of Kerio Connect, so it's still a relatively new feature. And it allows the receiving mail server to quite definitively identify who you are and essentially almost whitelist you at that point. And again, this is to make you trustworthy. It's kind of a common theme throughout the presentation is making your domain and your IP address trustworthy to the receiving mail server. So how it works, your outgoing Kerio Connect server creates a signature and inserts that into the headers of all outgoing email from a particular domain. The receiving mail server performs a DNS lookup, finds a TXT type of record which contains your public key, and that's something that I'll show that you have to configure within DNS, and it uses that public key to validate the signature that you've inserted into the headers of the message. So it's using DNS as a pretty definitive way to essentially authorize or verify that you are who you say you are. So this is a very effective way to essentially whitelist spam filters from a lot of receiving mail servers. So I've included a few links there where you can go to learn more about DKIM. We have a few different KB articles on it. Kind of the starting point is 1482. And then the official website for DKIM, dkim.org. And if you wanted to learn more, of course, I'm linking to Wikipedia throughout. I definitely enjoy that resource. There's a lot of well-written documentation there, so you can learn more from there. So Carson was just sort of asking me to see if there's any questions at this point. I suppose before I move on, I don't see anything yet in the Q&A, so I suppose nobody has any questions, which is either a good or bad thing. But again, feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and Karsten will try to address them as they come in. Otherwise, I can also answer those at the end of the presentation. So there's a few questions coming in. I'll let Karsten address those, and I'm going to go ahead and move on through the presentation here. So the next thing you can do, which is similar to DKIM in that it's using a DNS type of verification system, is Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. So again, it's to prevent spoofing. It's a way to authorize or authenticate your domain, but in this case, it's based on an IP address and not a signature in the email headers. And this also, of course, just like everything else, makes your domain name or IP address more trustworthy. So how it works is the receiving mail server performs a DNS lookup, checks, okay, is there an SPF record configured for this domain? If there is, that record is a TXT record that contains a list of IP addresses. And so it's going to compare that list against the sender IP address that your outgoing mail server is sending from. And then that's how it's validating the sender's IP address. Similar to DKIM, if it's a positive result, most likely you're going to go right through without any problems, and your IP address will be perhaps not whitelisted, but at least for that moment to allow the message to come through. It'll bypass any other additional layers of spam filtering by the receiving mail server. Where can I learn more about SPF? This is pretty much, although there is a checkbox to enable it on the receiving end inside of Kerio Connect, a lot of this configuration is done through DNS, and in terms of how do I properly format the SPF record so that I can update my DNS. There's some resources here where you can learn about that. There's a lot of different tools out there for generating an SPF record. This one is just one I found, spfwizard.net. It seems to be quite easy. You just put in your domain name. So like, for example, we have Vine Brewing. And I'm just going to make it about as easy as possible, saying, okay, anything that matches my MX record, just automatically approve that. So there's sort of some syntax within SPF for saying, okay, anything that's sending from a valid MX record, allow that. So in a lot of cases, this is sufficient. I mean, you'll probably need to, if you have any kind of external services, like I was talking about earlier, if you're using MailChimp or Marketo or some external service, you'll want to also include the host names or IP addresses here, and then it will give you the full syntax. So basically, everything that's in quotes is what you're going to want to use for your DNS record. So here I've included how it would look if you're using GoDaddy as a DNS manager. So you'll notice the two text records that I've created here for both an SPF and DKIM. So this value is what you would be capturing from that SPF wizard or whatever tool you're using to generate the proper syntax for the TXT record. In terms of the DKIM configuration, this is actually given to you or provided to you by Kerio Connect directly, and I'll show that during the demo, where you can go to capture this information. And I've got a few additional screenshots here just to show you. So when you're setting up the SPF record, you would use host as @ which basically means anything for your domain. You would apply the TXT value, which is here. And this is, again, what you would be copying and pasting from that whatever SPF generator you're using, like the one I was showing earlier. And in terms of the DKIM configuration, so the host, Kerio Connect always uses mail, and then the full host is mail._domain key, and then here's the part that you're going to copy and paste, and I'll show you again in the demo where to capture this information. So here's a couple of tools for verifying the DNS. So if you want to make sure, okay, well, I've just created a SPF record, a DKIM, MX record, a pointer record. How do I make sure that I've properly configured all those? So there's a lot of external tools. Obviously, if you're tech savvy, you can go into a terminal prompt and use dig and NSLOOKUP and these types of tools to verify records. But if you're like me and you like just going to a simplified web-based interface, there's a lot of them out there that have a very simplified tool. And as well, it's a good way to get a look at it from an outside network, because inside maybe your local DNS might be returning something different from what the rest of the world sees. So that's why I like using these external tools, because it's going to give you a better idea of what your DNS configuration will look like for the outside world. So this Scott Kitterman, he has an SPF lookup tool, and if I just put in, again, the fictitious domain that we've got, you say, okay, get SPF record, and then it'll come back and tell you, okay, this is the record I found, and it passed, and so everything looks okay. So this is what a successful lookup will say. So as for DKIM, you can go to dkimcore.org, and here you have a similar type of verification tool. Kerio Connect always uses mail as the selector, so you've got that mail._domain key as the host that you would provide, but there is a special DKIM has a selector, and that's what Kerio Connect will always use as mail. So that will be the selector, and then the domain is Vine Brewing. In my example here, again, back to my fictitious domain, so this would be whatever your domain name is. And then if we perform the check, this is what a successful verification will look like. So you've got the couple of different parameters and then the large public key here. which again, this is what you would be copying and pasting into your DNS from Kerio Connect, and I'll show that in the demo. As far as the IMEX and reverse lookup verifications, you can use IMEX Toolbox for that. They've got a pretty handy interface for doing all kinds of different types of DNS verifications. So the ones that I'll demonstrate here just quickly is the IMEX lookup. So my domain is Bind Brewing, and I'll just click play there. So it's going to verify that, okay, the MX record is mail.bindbrewing.com, and here's the IP address. And so everything checks out okay. I'm going to copy this IP address because now I'm going to do a reverse lookup. That's one of the options they give us here, is a reverse lookup or a PTR type of query. And we'll run that on the IP address. So this is related to the screenshot that I had shown earlier from our Webtropia setup from the co-located server we have in Germany. So you'll see the PTR resolves this IP to this name, so the reverse lookup looks valid, and the forward lookup then goes back to the IP address. So this is how it should look. The forward lookup resolving to an IP address, and then the IP address resolving to the same host name. So these should basically inverse to each other. So once you've got the SPF and DKIM properly configured within your Kerio Connect and within your DNS, a way to verify that it's actually working is to use Gmail. So just send yourself, if you've got a Gmail address, just send yourself an email and then look at the headers of that message. And what you should see is something like this. I've indicated in bold where your SPF record is passed, and then it gives you a little bit of additional information saying, okay, here's the email, and then it designates this IP as a permitted sender. So this SPF checked out okay, and the same with DKIM. So you can see it's saying that it passed. It's showing me what headers were inserted by my outgoing Kerio Connect server. So at this point, we'll go through a few different demonstrations. So let me jump over to, again, my fictitious Bind Brewing server here. So the first thing I'll show is the hiding of the local IP in the received headers. I really want to point this out because by default it's actually disabled, but it's really a helpful feature. And I'm actually pushing to get this enabled by default in future releases because it really has no negative consequence, and so but it does have a positive impact. So enabling this will ensure that senders that are outside your network that are using Kerio Connect client, for example, their their dynamic IP address, their personal IP that they're using at home or at a Starbucks or wherever is going to be hidden. It's going to actually be converted to the loopback address. So this is a very important option to enable. Under the queue options, this is where you'll see that delivery retry value that I was referring to earlier. So the default value is 30, and that's certainly sufficient. That's the recommended value. I would not suggest dropping below that because you might end up looking like an aggressive spammer. So in other words, you drop below that, you're not conforming to standards. So definitely do not reduce this value below 30. The other option I'll show here is under the spam filter, and it is the spam repellent. So you'll notice that in our case it's disabled. So that was sort of my suggestion is to disable it. If you want to keep it enabled, because it is a fairly helpful anti-spam feature, I would say something modest like 15 seconds or in that ballpark, because if you go too high, it's perhaps going to cause some problems when that receiving server does the callback verification and might time out. So, and then again, with all of the additional checking that your Connect server might do in terms of the blacklist lookups and so forth, you might set 25 seconds. It may actually take 30 seconds or more. So again, it's maybe not the best idea to have this, especially anything higher than about 15 seconds.
Let me just quickly chime in. This could definitely be also a problem when you're checking with the MX Toolbox. Whenever you're going to use the MX Toolbox and you do not get any results, it could be that your customer has maybe activated the spam repellent and its time frame is too high, so the MX Toolbox times out.
Yeah. Thanks, Carson. Yes, that's true. Actually, I found that as well when I was testing with MX Toolbox. I think their tool waits for about 20 seconds and then assumes that your server is down if it doesn't receive a greeting within that time frame. So again, there's more and more reasons that I've run into to perhaps either not enable this or to set it to something very low, like 15 seconds, which may actually be somewhat ineffective at that point because even spam servers, I think, are even catching on to this technique, and so I think at this point it may not even be a terribly effective anti-spam measure. So it perhaps might be doing actually more harm than good. Let's see. So the next option that I wanted to show you is under domains. So I've been referring to the internet host name in several of the slides in the presentation. So that's configured here, this button, internet host name. So you'll see we've set that here as mail.bindbrewing.com. So this would typically be whatever your MX record is configured as. So in our case, mail.bindbrewing.com, but usually it's mail. Or smtp. But any name that resolves to the IP address of your server would be sufficient. But ideally, it probably should match what's on your SSL certificate and what you've configured as the MX record. This value is actually used during SMTP conversations, whether it's outgoing or incoming. It's how the server identifies its identity. So it's a very important value. So the next thing I'll show is where to configure the postmaster alias. So that is here under accounts and then aliases. So I have just the one domain here, and then I will click add. Let's go ahead and add the postmaster alias, and we'll select a user. Just choose myself. Okay, and that's that. So again, this is part of the RFC. I think it was 2821, if I'm not mistaken, for SMTP. So this will allow receiving mail servers, or anyone for that matter, to have some way of contacting the administrator or the responsible person for this domain name, and it's something that, again, is conforming to standards and is appreciated and will help to add to the trustworthiness of your domain. So the last option that I'll show here is where you would go to enable domain keys, and that's under the domain. And if you edit your domain, it's under the General tab here. So first thing is to configure the DNS. So because if you try to enable this option and you have not configured DNS, it's going to kick back a warning that it didn't find a valid DKIM record. So first step is to show the public key. So this is where you would capture the record name. So when I was showing my GoDaddy screenshot, this is the host name that I was providing in the TXT record, and then the value is what's here, starting with V and then ending with the end of the string here. So these are the two items that you would be putting into your DNS. And we do have a knowledge base article that talks about this similar, how to capture this information and update your DNS, although I think it's catered more towards if you're configuring bind, which is modifying actual configuration files, which is probably perhaps for some of you very feasible, but for others and for many of you who probably use some type of web-based control panel for managing DNS, the applicable information here is this part followed by this part. So if you've done that right, when you enable or when you check this box, DKIM will be enabled. So now any email that's sent from mybindbrewing.com domain will include that DKIM signature. And again, that's probably one of the most effective ways to bypass any spam filters by outside mail servers, especially Gmail or Yahoo. If you're sending to any of those domains, by having a DKIM record will almost surely guarantee that you'll get through. So I believe that was the last demo that we had. We enabled the option to hide the local IP and received headers, verified that the retry interval was not less than 30 seconds. We showed where to disable the spam repellent, reviewed the internet host name. We added a postmaster alias. We enabled DKIM. So at this point, we can go into the question and answer, and it looks like Karsten has been answering a lot of the questions here. It looks like he's left a few for me here.
Yes, there's a question. I will not put on my mic because I'm going directly
okay, yeah.
to avoid some echo. Steve Weiler has just asked if we have registered our email at the emailrec.org. It's something for look. Have you used it to register your email domain so it will be whitelisted? I don't think so, as far as I know. No.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this service. Let's see. Perhaps that was related to a particular slide that I was on. Oh, emailreg.org. Yeah, so I'm not familiar with emailreg.org, so I'll have to perhaps research that and see. Perhaps that might be another service for whitelisting your domain name, similar to the DKIM and the SPF that I was mentioning earlier. So yeah, again, I'm not too familiar with that, so I'll have to research that and look into it.
And there's another question. If you have a spam service in front of Kerio, how does that affect DKIM?
That's certainly fine. The DKIM is something that's added when you're sending outbound mail. So everything outbound is going through your Kerio Connect server. So the DKIM record is added at that point. So whether you're sending mail directly out through the internet or whether you're relaying your outbound mail through another provider, either way DKIM will work. It shouldn't really make a difference because you're modifying the headers of the message as it's being composed and sent through Kerio Connect. So in other words, yeah, it shouldn't make a difference if you're using an external provider for relaying mail.
There was another question I've already answered. Maybe you can tell something additional to it. If you're hiding a client IP address and someone is using a user's account to send spam, how do you find the IP address? I basically think when you have a suspicious mail sent from any account within your intranet or something, you still can check and search for this suspicious mail in the mail log, so you can identify from what IP it was sent. It's related to the thing where you have said hide IP, local IP address. Yeah? So this is a question, how could I find out the spammer in my environment if I'm hiding the IP address from the sender? But I think I can still check it out in the mail log.
It's still in the logs, yes, for sure. Hopefully they were able to hear your question, but basically if you check that box to hide the sender's IP address, that's only, maybe I didn't mention it clearly, but it's only removing it from the email headers that the receiving mail server will see. In terms of the logs, the mail log or any other logs, the sender's true IP address will show up in there. So that option, again, will only help you and pretty much won't hurt you. So you can still verify if that was a spammer or maybe a mailbox was compromised or whatnot. You'll still be able to see from the mail log what the actual true offending IP address was.
PC call, when you click on it, you can see you would love to, if we can show how to configure the DKIM record in the DNS. I don't know.
Yeah, so I had provided a screenshot earlier on. Perhaps I can show that again, but otherwise I'd have to log into our GoDaddy setup. But again, you might be using a different provider for and having some different user interface for how you manage DNS records. But again, this is what the record looks like, at least for GoDaddy. Now this is a TXT record. So within GoDaddy, I'm saying create new TXT record. And for the host value, I'm using this, which is what Kerio Connect provided to me. And this, which is also what Kerio Connect provided. If I go back and then I click on Show Public Key, so you see it's this part combined with this part. So that's hopefully sufficient, but yeah, I think for now that's pretty much all that I can provide. Again, the knowledge base article has similar related content. If you just search for DKIM in the knowledge base, you'll pull up an article on how to configure DNS for DKIM.
So PC call, I can just tell you, for example, I'm with my private Kerio Connect. My domain is a domain factory, and the interface looks completely different from the GoDaddy. So, but the basic information you need to provide are always the same, but the interfaces where you have to fill it in look pretty different from provider to provider. So it is pretty difficult for us to provide every provider interface you are seeing when you want to make a DKIM record. But basically, it's always the same.
Yeah, so the values that I was showing there are the two main values: the mail._domain key, and then copying and pasting the part that is after TXT value.
When you go to the question from John Clayton, exactly.
So there's a question about DKIM with multiple domains. So every domain name has its own DNS configuration. So the actual key is going to be the same, I believe. So it's going to be the same value, this part that you would be copying and pasting. But it is the DKIM is specific to each domain name. So for every domain that you have configured, you will need to separately configure the TXT record and the DNS for each of those domains.
Basically, John, can you close the window, Brian, please? There is a Learn More link under the domain keys, which brings you and forwards you, I think, directly to our KB article. And there's also mentioned that, for example, every domain alias you are using, you need to provide an own DKIM TXT record. I hope this helps.
Yes. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. So I think we can go ahead and close out here. So my closing slide, if you've done everything right, there's a good chance that your mail will go through, hopefully better than 1 in a million.
Yeah, the last question, if we are providing the slides, yeah, we can definitely make some PDF.
Right, yes,
yeah,
so we can certainly share the presentation for those of you that would like to have an offline version. Of course, this is also a recorded presentation, so you can view it that way. Afterwards, we'll send you all the recording link. But yeah, we'll make sure that this page is publicly available so that you can review the content offline afterwards.